From The Conversation, this is Politics with Michelle Grattan.
The federal opposition is in dire straits. Sunday's news poll had the Liberals on just 15%, with the Nationals on 3%. In contrast, One Nation was on 27%. The coalition reunited at the weekend, but the two parties have big, longer-term problems working together. Susan Lee's leadership is considered terminal, with Angus Taylor readying for an imminent challenge. But a new leader won't solve the Liberals' problems, which go much deeper. To discuss their situation and the way forward, we're joined today by Tony Barry. He's a one-time Liberal staffer, but now is a director of the consultancy firm Redbridge, which does extensive polling and other political research. Tony Barry, give us a thumbnail sketch of where the Liberal Party is at the present time. What are your focus groups telling you about people's thoughts about the opposition?
Well, the problem for the Liberal Party right now is we don't know where the floor is, and we don't know where the ceiling is for One Nation vote. So at the moment, the reformed coalition parties, if you put their votes together, sub 20%, which is catastrophic. Normally, Michelle, as you know, the coalition needs a primary vote at least in the 40s. John Howard had 39% in 1998, the GST election, which ironically was the time when One Nation sort of burst onto the scene, recorded some high news poll numbers, and then sort of came back to the pack, but still recorded 8.5% at that election, a large proportion of which flowed back to the coalition. So they were able to win on a 2PP basis and have a majority of seats, most importantly. But they're now, half of that primary vote. In terms of percentages, they're now at around 19%. So they're not just a little bit off the pace, they're almost at rock bottom.
And just in qualitative terms, in the focus groups, how do people perceive the Liberals at the moment?
Look, at the moment, when you prompt respondents to the question about, well, imagine I've been away overseas and we've just come back and we've caught up for a coffee, and I ask you to describe the Liberal Party or the Labor Party to me in a couple of sentences, how would you describe it? That way we get their sort of top of mind response, whether it be positive, negative, whether there's a theme in their responses. And look, at the moment, unfortunately for the Liberal Party, they just kind of laugh. There is substantive brand damage and they don't take the party seriously. And the reason for that, of course, is because at the moment, the coalition is full of very unserious people.
At the moment, as we record this interview, we expect a challenge from Angus Taylor very imminently. How much better off do you think the Liberals are likely to be with a change of leader?
Well, the problem for the Liberal Party and the coalition generally, as I mentioned before, is they need to get their primary vote into the 40s. Now, in real terms, you're talking about 3.4, 3.5 million voters, give or take a couple 100,000 extra. So they need around 3.5 million extra voters at the moment. Now, that is a phenomenal amount out of a electoral roll of around 18 million. So will one personality be able to win those 3.5 million votes? Unlikely. What's the best way to win those votes? Well, the best way to make the coalition tent bigger, have a bigger tent, is to tap into the most important issue in the electorate right now, which is the economy and housing. They are the biggest and most important issues. And the coalition really needs to focus on that. So if there is a change of leadership, it's only going to be a success in the medium term if they can shape an economic narrative, perhaps put out some economic reform, and give people some hope that the coalition does have an economic plan, because at the moment, there is an entrenched pessimism in the electorate. The wrong direction is at 55%. 55% of Australian voters say Australia is heading in the wrong direction. That's a massive problem for the government. And 56% of voters say the next generation will be worse off than their parents' generation. So there's an entrenched pessimism. There's a lot of problems for Labor. They've got a lot of very big problems, but the Liberal Party isn't one of them.
Well, Angus Taylor has an economic background. On the other hand, he didn't do very well last term as Shadow Treasurer against Jim Chalmers. And even more basically, in terms of the party itself, would he have the capacity to bridge this divide between the moderates and the conservatives, or is John Howard's broad church simply a dead concept for the future?
Well, I think the problem with the John Howard's broad church is now it's sort of turning into an actual church. There's a strong element of that in the party today.
Just explain that.
Well, I think, there is that concept of a religious right that is a dominant force in the party as opposed to the broad church of John Howard, the big tent, as it were. But I think in terms of Angus Taylor's economic credentials, he is well qualified, as is, I might add, Ted O'Brien. They both got very good CVs in terms of an economic story to tell.
He's Shadow Treasurer at the moment, just for our listeners.
Shadow Treasurer, yeah. So, but it takes more than just personality, even with a good CV, particularly in the economic space. They actually need the party to have a mindset where they are prepared to take some bold risks. I saw an interview with John Howard with Troy Bramson before Christmas where he encouraged some bold policy development, and one suggestion he had was to increase the GST rate, but offset that revenue gain with significant income tax cuts. Because if the coalition is to appeal to that Gen Z and millennial cohort, which they need to, because at the moment they're polling catastrophically in that group, then, having a policy prescription which lets them keep more of their income so they can accumulate wealth and accumulate assets, I think is an opportunity for the coalition to increase their primary vote.
That sounds a fairly hazardous policy, I must say, in political terms. Wouldn't the Liberals be better to embrace, for example, indexation of income tax?
Well, I think there's any number of different policies. That was one that John Howard suggested, just in an interview context. I think being bold, though, is the only option the coalition has got. I think at the moment it's a case of do they die on their feet fighting for something, or do they die on their knees? And I think, going to the election with a pretty modest policy offering like, well, we're going to give you cheaper petrol for 12 months is not a pathway to success. Just hoping for grievance in the electorate to get you to 51% and a majority of seats is not the way forward. Because at the moment, as we know, One Nation is tapping into that grievance with some fairly reductive policy offerings. And so the coalition needs to differentiate themselves from both Labor and the One Nation party and offer something around the economy. That is the number one issue right now. In our polling, around 75% have cost of living in their top three issues. There is this entrenched pessimism that I mentioned before. But when it comes to when we ask respondents who is the best party to manage the economy, just 19% say the coalition. So only 19%. I mean, you go back to the Howard and Costello government, and they had a very strong equity lead on that question. And the foundation of all their success was actually on economic management, because every year there was, in most years, there was income tax cuts, there was significant wage growth. And so these were the things that Howard and Costello leveraged to keep on getting re-elected. And, yes, things like national security were a big factor in 2001, but the foundations of their success was on the economy. And they've given that away. We know from all sorts of polling, public and private, that they no longer have a lead on that.
You have previously said, Tony, on this podcast, that the Liberals should not move to the right. But a Taylor leadership would, of course, signal that or be seen as signalling that, would it not?
Well, John Howard was typically considered to be from the right, but he was smart enough to know that he needed to embrace the broad church. He promoted significant people from the moderate faction like Amanda Vanstone and Robert Hill. And so, he realises that you needed to be somewhere right of centre. And he focused his message on mums and dads, typically, plus older voters, and made sure that they were receiving some of the economic promise of Australia. So regular income tax cuts, wage growth, lots of jobs, and an economy that was seen to be delivering for people. So that was his main focus. And I think there's nothing stopping Angus Taylor from embracing a similar model. I think it's okay to have those personal beliefs. The real test, of course, as a leader is to bring it all together.
Of course, in the past, though, there was more money sloshing around to give income tax cuts, to compensate losers if you made significant changes. The situation is very different now, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there's around $1 trillion in federal government debt, around $500 billion in state government debt, with potentially 10 more years of deficit budgets to come. So, yes, you're right. From an economic point of view, there's not a lot of money for a government to sort of pitch towards swing voters. But I think coming back to that sort of prospect of some bold economic policies, I think perhaps the time is right for the coalition to sort of say to the electorate, we need to have a serious conversation about where the economy is at. I think we're seeing in our focus groups voters realise that. And as I said, we've measured that quantitatively. There is this entrenched pessimism, a strong wrong direction, 55%. It was 65% right direction under the Howard government. So that gives you an idea of just how dramatically it's changed. And so I think whilst it comes with enormous risk, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that it's a slam dunk for the coalition. But I think there is an appetite in the electorate for some tough talk about where the economy is at. I think they realise that some tough decisions need to be made. It does present a large bullseye for Jim Chalmers to aim at. But at the moment, the coalition are on a hiding to nothing, just sort of hoping that a deteriorating economy will sort of drive people into their arms. There's no evidence in the data that suggests that's going to happen.
While her leadership limitations have been widely canvassed, it's still a bit of a mystery that Susan Lee has failed so comprehensively to make any positive impression in the electorate. Why is this, do you think?
Well, I think it's a combination of the last two election results have been catastrophic. The coalition brand has been smashed to pieces. It's lost its economic advantage that was all pre-Susan Lee. She inherited that. I don't think she's been given the clear air that she deserves as a leader to establish her bona fides as a leader, and all the public is seeing is dysfunction. And so I think that is damaging her as well. She's probably made a few missteps, as all leaders do, including the Prime Minister has made some missteps since the last election. And I think they've been a little bit overstated by some of her internal critics. But yeah, fundamentally in politics, if you can define the problem correctly, you've almost got the solution. And at the moment, the coalition have not been able to define the problem correctly. So they're chasing litmus test issues. They're looking at sort of fringe issues in the hope that that might deliver this 3.5 million extra voters that they need to find. And I think, it comes back to that sort of Howard, Tim Fisher model of internal trade-offs rather than seeking to impose litmus tests and reasons for internal difference rather than a prioritisation of common ground.
Do you think that there would be any costs in the party rolling the first female leader after such a brief time?
Yeah, I think that does come with, all leadership transactions come with cost. The question is there a net gain? I think, the coalition has been struggling with the female vote, younger vote, young professional women in particular, white collar, tertiary educated. So I think there is a real cost there that your likes of Tanya Plibersek, Claire O'Neill, Penny Wong will sort of line up and completely slot the Liberal Party for rolling a female leader. I think there'll be various other voices out there as well criticising that. So there is a big transactional cost here. And what the new leader, if there is one, will need to do is to very, very quickly get out of the blocks and offer something on the economic policy front that's bold to sort of fill in that vacuum in the media cycle.
Just in terms of the Liberals needing to win more of the female vote, there's a lot of talk of quotas, but doesn't the problem go far beyond quotas?
Yeah, well, at the moment, really the only cohort where the coalition is performing well is the boomer cohort and regional areas. At the moment, they only have 9 out of 88 urban seats as defined by the AEC. Even at state level, they're struggling in the urban seats. In Queensland, where Crisafulli is a very good political product, most of their seats were won in the regions. They only won 3 urban seats at the last election. Now, Queensland is a bit of an outlier in Australia because around half of its population are in the regions, but other states around Australia are very, very urbanised. In Victoria, for example, 85% of the population live in Melbourne. So, the coalition's got problems everywhere, including the female cohort. But broadly, you could define it as an urban problem. And of course, in Gen Z, they're polling at around 18% primary vote, which is cataclysmic. And in the millennial cohort, it's up around the mid-20s. So again, well off the pace where they need to be. And in Gen X, which is where we've seen the most recent changes to the voting behaviours and voting patterns and polling, most of the One Nation growth, which is now 27% on our polling, is coming from that Gen X cohort. Not exclusively, but that is where the substantive amount of that growth is coming from. And we're seeing that in our focus groups that Gen X are deeply frustrated. They've got financial challenges, particularly mums and dads have a whole series of pressures and stresses. For those people with desk jobs, they're very worried about AI and what that's going to do. And then those people with physical jobs, they're very worried about their capacity to work in these very physical jobs until the age of 65 and accumulate wealth for retirement. So they're a highly stressed cohort that the coalition is now losing as well, mostly to One Nation. And, this presents another problem for the coalition, and it's another reason why they need to get back to an economic narrative that offers that cohort hope.
So, do you see this surge in One Nation as essentially driven by negatives, that the Liberal Party is not seen as acceptable to vote for these days because of its problems? And do you think it's a temporary thing, or is that now going to become baked in?
There is a bit of a hostile takeover of from One Nation of the coalition vote. It's mostly come from the coalition pile. What we don't know yet, and we won't really know until the election, how much of this is protest and how much of this is power. I'm seeing enough in the focus groups to suggest that this is about empowerment of One Nation. These voters want to empower One Nation to shake things up. One of the most interesting things in our last poll, in my mind, was not so much the vote share. We asked voters which of the following statements best represents your view about the political system. Minor change, major change, it doesn't need any change, or burn it all down. 15% of voters said burn it all down. 45% of voters said a more moderate language of the system requires major change. So that gives you a mindset of where a lot of the voters are at in terms of their perceptions and assessments of the system. Amongst One Nation voters, which we had at 27%, 83% of those who said they were intending to vote for One Nation said burn it all down. So again, that gives you a real insight as to where their heads are at in terms of assessments of the system. And that sort of frustration is manifesting itself in Pauline Hanson and Barnaby Joyce, who they see as vehicles to really shake it all up, instead of this sort of almost sort of paper shuffling kind of policy offerings that they're getting from the major parties at the moment.
So, does Barnaby Joyce seem to be an asset, a potential asset for One Nation? What are people saying about him?
Yeah, I think he has the potential to grow the vote, and I think it is possible that he has contributed to some of the growth in vote most recently. The reason for that is that he does bring something to One Nation that Pauline Hanson doesn't have, which is he does have government experience. He was a former Deputy Prime Minister. Regardless of your views of Barnaby Joyce, and I've got my own personal views, he's not an idiot. He can read spreadsheets. He can read a budget. I agree with Peter Costello's assessment in his book that, Barnaby Joyce will take credit for the strong economy of the coalition government, but he will argue internally and externally against every responsible economic measure taken to deliver that good economy. But nevertheless, he can craft an economic narrative. It might be very reductive in nature, but it appeals to that grievance in the electorate that are feeling frustrated. And there's a lot of anxiety out in the electorate. The three biggest issues this year in terms of the impact on the economy and politics will be interest rates, and we've already seen one interest rate rise, AI and what that does. Already voters are anxious about it and what it means for their futures. And of course, Donald Trump is the most pervasive influence on Australian political cycles since all the way with LBJ. Never before has an American president so atomized the Australian media cycle like Donald Trump has. And in that last poll that we did for the Fin Review, we asked voters an open-ended question so they can type in the answers as opposed to a laundry list of options for them to choose from. We said, what is the biggest single issue that you've heard in the media over the last week? Donald Trump came in second at 18%. Now, you go back to, say, the Howard government. I was doing focus groups then. George W. Bush was not. They absolutely knew who the president of the United States was. They were aware when he made significant decisions, whether it be the war on terror, response to September 11 and so forth. But it wasn't like he bent the media cycle literally every week like Donald Trump does. And again, that just makes it even harder for an opposition that doesn't control the microphone to be able to, sort of get a consistent, coherent message out there.
Just another point on One Nation. How important a measure will be the South Australian election for their performance, their current performance?
I think if they overperform, that is going to send shockwaves to Canberra. There was a poll published on the front page of the Advertiser this morning from Fox and Hedgehog that had the One Nation primary vote at 20% and the Liberal Party at 19%. So similar voting patterns to what we're seeing federally. Even if they don't really pick up many seats, polling 20% and where those preferences go is going to be very keenly looked at by major party strategists and the media, because if most of those One Nation votes flow back to the South Australian Liberal Party, are able to sort of hold all their rural seats and not lose too many urban seats, that will probably be seen as a bit of a win. But if those One Nation votes really spray, which they do tend to do, they don't typically flow back strongly like the Greens do to Labor, for example. And it's usually around the 60% region, 65% region. So everybody will be keenly watching that on election night in South Australia.
Tony Barry, you've been in and then observing Liberal Party politics for a very long time. Do you believe the next Liberal Prime Minister is in the Parliament?
No, I think it's quite possible. But it's going to require an internal mindset change, not just from the Liberal Party, but the coalition as a whole, where they do make the internal trade-offs that are necessary to make themselves competitive again. And at the moment, we're just seeing too many individuals who are imposing litmus tests and trying to find points for internal difference rather than that common ground. And I think, the common ground that unified the coalition in the early 90s, and John Hewson, I don't think gets enough credit for this, is an economic statement. And John Howard and Peter Costello sort of finished that project. But that kind of brought all these fragments of the coalition together and gave them something to fight for and something to talk about. So I think that's going to be critical to the coalition's future fortunes. And so I think it's less about the personality and more about the focus of the party as a whole.
Tony Barry, thank you very much for your observations and insights in what is a pretty dramatic week in Liberal Party politics. That's all for today's podcast. Thank you to my producer, Ben Roper. We'll be back with another interview soon, but goodbye for now.
Production by Ben Roper. Theme music by Lee Rosevere. The Conversation is a not-for-profit media organisation. Sign up to our daily newsletter for evidence-based news and analysis, including articles from Michelle Grattan, or listen to more of our shows wherever you get your podcasts.
What are you going to have? Can I have 2 pieces of mullet, please, Pauline?
From a fish and chip shop in regional Queensland
We are in danger of being swamped by Asians.
to the heart of Australian politics, this is the unlikely story of the country's most controversial minor party.
Are you xenophobic? Please explain.
For 30 years, One Nation and Pauline Hanson have been ridiculed, dismissed and shut out. Now, no one's laughing.
One Nation continuing to surge in the polls.
Dramatic surge in support for One Nation.
I'm back.
This is The Making of One Nation from The Conversation, and you can search for it wherever you listen to podcasts.